People ask me what I said when the Sethavar commander looked at me across that hangar deck and asked what I was. The honest answer is nothing. I stood there in my station coveralls with the terrace ring visible through the viewport behind him like a god's halo, and I had absolutely no answer. I've thought about that moment for 2 years now. I've thought about what I should have said, what a better man would have said, what a man who reads history and knows the shape of things might have offered. Some clean line, some declaration that would have landed with the weight the moment deserved. But I'm a life support systems technician, not a diplomat. I spent 41 years making sure orbital stations didn't kill their crews through oxygen failure, coolant breach, pressure drop, or fire suppression malfunction. I know pipe. I know manifold. I know the sound a seal makes when it's 3 hours from failure if you are paying attention, and 6 hours from catastrophe if you are not. I know what the air smells like when it is cycling correctly, and I know the subtler smell, not bad exactly, but off. That tells you something in the distribution grid has shifted before the gauges tell you the same thing. That knowledge is not transferable to standing in front of an alien commander and explaining yourself. What I am is not a word the Sethavar Dominion has. That's not an answer either, but it's the closest I've gotten in 2 years of trying. I'll tell it from the beginning, or near enough. Not the very beginning. The very beginning is too old and too painful, and I was unconscious for most of it. I'll tell it from when I woke up, because that's the moment that made everything else possible. And I'll tell you what was waiting for me when I did. My name is Davin Cross. I am 64 years old, though for the purposes of most legal documents, my age is complicated. I was born in the town of Cal Drift, a pressure dome settlement on the northern face of orbital platform Harrow, which is not a planet and not a ship, but something in between. A station built large enough to qualify as a small city, anchored in geosynchronous orbit 40,000 kilometers above the equatorial sea. I worked on Harrow Station for 22 years before the Sethavar Dominion arrived and changed the nature of everything. This was 18 years ago. I want to be precise about that because the number matters. The Dominion's first contact was a fleet of 9 capital ships arriving on the dayside approach, making no signal, broadcasting no identification, observing no standard protocol. Our patrol craft challenged them. The Dominion did not respond. They moved into optimal engagement distance and opened fire on Harrow Station's central housing ring without any further communication. We lost 1,140 people in the first 4 minutes. I was in sub-level 14 at the time, which is the deepest accessible layer of Harrow's original infrastructure. The old bones of the station, laid down 60 years before I was born, where the primary atmospheric recycling manifolds run, and where nobody goes unless something is broken. Something was broken. A seal on return loop 7 had been flagging a slow pressure anomaly for a week, and I had rescheduled the inspection twice because of crew rotation gaps. I was 3 hours into the job when the first round hit the housing ring above me. The lights went out. The structure moved, not the gentle vibration of engine cycling, not the minor harmonic shimmer of a docking approach, but a full lateral displacement, a sound like a mountain falling sideways. I grabbed the manifold bracket and held on. The secondary lighting came up in orange emergency tones, and the station's damage AI began its announcements in a flat, automated voice that was almost insulting in its calm. I remember thinking, we trained for this. We trained for this, and I never believed it would happen, and now it's happening, and I need to move. I moved. Sublevel 14 has 2 emergency cryopods, installed by whoever built the original station bones in an era when people were more worried about catastrophic depressurization than I was. Pod 1 was at the far end of the main recycling corridor, a sealed cabinet behind a panel I had walked past 1,000 times. Pod 2 was at the junction where loops 7 and 8 met, about 40 meters from where I was standing when the lights went out. I knew where they were. I knew the access codes. I had run a maintenance check on both 6 months prior, per station protocol, and both were fully charged and operational. I got to Pod 2. I did not get into it immediately. I want to be clear about this because it matters to what came later. The return loop manifolds are tied into the station's atmospheric distribution grid. If loop 7 failed, if that seal let go under the structural stress of a bombardment, it would not kill just sublevel 14. It would cascade through the distribution grid and begin venting processed oxygen from every connected compartment, which in Harrow's old bone structure included the hospital wing, 2 residential blocks, and the emergency shelter on level 12 where we had sent 400 people when the first alarm sounded. I couldn't leave it. I didn't even consider leaving it, which I understand sounds either heroic or stupid, and I promise you it was neither. It was just arithmetic. If I sealed the loop and got into the pod, the cascade wouldn't happen. If I got into the pod first, it would, and there would be no one else down here to stop it. I sealed the loop. It took 47 minutes. The station was being hit repeatedly during those 47 minutes. I don't have a precise count of the impacts because I was not counting. I was working. I can tell you that by the time I was finished, 2 of the 4 lights in sublevel 14 were gone. A section of outer hull plating had buckled inward about 12 centimeters, and I had a bleeding gash across my left forearm from a pipe joint that had sheared off its mounting bracket and swung into me in the dark. I remember the blood made the work slippery. I remember wrapping my hand around the manifold coupling and feeling my grip fail and having to try again. I got it sealed. Then I got into the pod. What I did not know, in the 47 minutes I was working, was that the evacuation had already occurred. Most of Harrow's crew had reached the lifeboats, the emergency shuttles, the docking ring vessels. The Dominion had held fire on the evacuation traffic. I learned this later, and I still don't know if it was mercy or contempt. Perhaps they simply didn't consider fleeing civilians worth the ordnance. What I also didn't know was that the Dominion's third wave strike, which came approximately 30 minutes after I entered the pod, collapsed sublevel 14's access corridor completely and buried Pod 2 under 6 meters of structural debris. The pod survived. The pod is built to survive. That's its only job. I was in it for 16 years. I need to stop here and say something about 16 years. I did not experience 16 years. The pod's cryosuspension is total. No dreams, no passage of time, no awareness of any kind. From my subjective experience, I closed the pod's inner seal, felt the sedative push of the initiation sequence, and then opened my eyes in a medical bay on a station I did not recognize, with a doctor leaning over me whose name I did not know, asking me to track her finger with my eyes. But the world experienced 16 years. Harrow Station experienced 16 years. Earth experienced 16 years. The Dominion left and humanity did not collapse, and what happened in those 16 years is a thing I have spent the 2 years since my awakening trying to fully understand. I don't think I have fully understood it. I don't think I will. Here is what I know. The Dominion hit 7 orbital platforms in their strike sequence. Harrow was the largest. 3 platforms were destroyed completely. 3 more were damaged enough that the Dominion's post-strike assessment, which was later recovered through a decryption effort I don't fully understand, classified them as non-viable for reconstitution without directed resource infusion. The Dominion's conclusion, based on their assessment, was that humanity's orbital infrastructure had been reduced below the threshold for independent recovery. Their projected timeline for total planetary civilizational collapse was 40 to 60 years. They filed their report. They left. They were wrong. I don't think they were wrong in a stupid way. Their assessment was based on everything they could observe. Harrow's housing ring was rubble. The other damaged platforms were dark and silent. The lifeboats and shuttles were scattered. By every reasonable metric, The Dominion had done what they came to do. The remaining orbital infrastructure was not enough to sustain the kind of civilization that might one day be a problem for them. What they could not observe was what was in sublevel 14. The loop seal I had made held. It held for the 11 days Harrow's remaining emergency power, kept the atmospheric grid running before that power finally failed. During those 11 days, before the platform was declared evacuated and sealed, 17 people who had not made it to the evacuation lifeboats were found alive in the areas the sealed loop had kept pressurized. 17 people who would have died if the seal had failed. 17 people who were evacuated by the recovery crew that came back specifically because the atmospheric sensors on the departing emergency shuttle registered that sublevel 14's Loop 7 was still holding pressure, which meant either there was a sealed compartment or there was a ghost. Those 17 people included the station's chief structural engineer, a woman named Marin Vostek. Marin Vostek spent the next 14 years directing the reconstruction of Harrow Station. I tell people this when they ask how one man stopped the Sethovar Dominion, because the answer is, one man didn't. One man sealed a loop, went into a pod, and then 16 years of humanity happened. Humanity remembered. Humanity rebuilt. Humanity was patient and precise and deeply angry in a quiet way that does not require speeches. Marin Vostek designed the terrace ring, not alone. She would be furious if I said alone, but she drove it. She insisted on its scale. She said build it larger than you think you need because they will come back, and when they do we are not going to have this conversation twice. The terrace ring is not a ring in the classical sense. It is a continuous orbital defense architecture, 41,000 kilometers in circumference, anchored at 8 equatorial points, carrying 112 weapons platforms, 47 sensor arrays, 22 repair and resupply stations, and the housing infrastructure for approximately 60,000 personnel. It was built in 14 years from scratch, starting from rubble. Harrow Station, rebuilt, sits at ring anchor point 4. It is 5 times the size it was when I worked there. It has a proper hospital now, and a park, and a school, and a population of 9,000 people who were born there and have never lived anywhere else. The school has a history curriculum that begins with what the Dominion did and does not soften it, because Marin Vostek insisted on that too. When I woke up, I was in the hospital on ring anchor point 4, which is to say I woke up inside the thing my loop seal made possible, without knowing any of that yet. The doctor who asked me to track her finger was named Pev. She was kind. She was prepared for my disorientation, which she said was normal, and for my confusion about the passage of time, which she said was also normal, and for the fact that when I finally understood that it had been 16 years and not 6 hours, I did not say anything for a long time. She sat with me. She didn't push. I have tried to describe what those first hours were like. I haven't managed it well. It is not the disorientation of waking from deep sleep, when the world reassembles itself from the familiar pieces around you. It is the disorientation of waking to a world that has reassembled itself while you were absent and done so in ways you cannot fully take in at once. The room was the wrong shape. The light was slightly the wrong tone. The equipment around me was 16 years newer than the equipment I knew, and it showed in small ways materials slightly different, interfaces slightly changed, a kind of refinement that happens when 16 years of engineers iterate on a design. The window showed a star field that was familiar but bounded by a structural element I did not recognize, which was, I later understood, part of the new Harrow's expanded outer ring. Dr. Pev had a protocol for this, which told me that I was not the first cryo-recovery she had managed, though I was, she told me later, the longest. The protocol was sensible. No news immediately, no orientation materials, no timeline of events. Just presence, just the tracking exercises, just the gradual confirmation that the body was intact and the mind was coherent. She asked me questions I could answer: my name, the date I last remembered, the last task I had been doing before the bombardment, and she wrote them down without expressing surprise or distress, and that deliberate neutrality was its own kind of kindness. She was giving me a version of the world in which nothing had to be true yet except that I was alive. I asked her what year it was and she told me. I asked her to say it again and she did. I asked her what happened to Harrow Station and she said, "It was rebuilt and it's where you are now." I looked at the window. I looked at the structural element I didn't recognize. I understood, in the slow way that very large facts become real, that 16 years had passed, and that the station around me was not the station I had known, and that the life I had been living was not somewhere paused and waiting for me to return to it. It had been lived without me, and it had been extended in ways I could not yet see, because of what I had done in sublevel 14 before I stopped being present for any of it. The first thing I said eventually was, "Did Loop 7 hold?" She didn't know what I was talking about. She had to look it up. It held for 11 days, she told me. It held long enough. I spent the next 2 years learning what I had slept through. This is not as simple as reading a history. History gives you the facts. It does not give you the weight of 16 years, or the particular way a person stands when they have spent 14 years rebuilding something that was destroyed by something they could not stop. I met Marin Vostek 4 months after I woke up. She was 67, gray-haired, and she had a way of looking at a structural drawing the way I look at a manifold schematic, as if the drawing is telling her something it doesn't know it's saying. She showed me the terrace ring plans. She showed me her original notes. In the margin of the first page, in handwriting I could barely read, she had written, "Loop 7 held. Build from that." I didn't know what to say to her either. I went back to work. I am a life support systems technician. Work was what I had. Harrow Station in its rebuilt form had an infrastructure 10 times more complex than the old bones I had spent 22 years maintaining, and they were short-staffed on people who understood the old manifold logic that the new system was still rooted in. I spent 6 months in retraining, not because I was slow, but because there was simply that much new to learn. And then I took my post in sublevel 14 of the new Harrow, which is nothing like the old sublevel 14 in any physical sense, but which occupies the same position in the station's architecture, and which I chose deliberately. Some things you go back to. The new sublevel has 12 return loops instead of 8, and the manifold coupling system is a generation newer than what I learned on, and the emergency cryopods are rated for 25 years now instead of 12, and the access corridor has emergency lighting that runs on a separate power cell so it cannot be knocked out by the same strike that takes the primary grid. Someone thought carefully about that last change. I know who. I read the engineering report, and I know why. There is a directness to the post-Dominion infrastructure that you recognize if you understand what the old infrastructure failed to prevent. Every improvement is a memory. Every redundancy is a decision made by someone who remembered and would not let it happen the same way twice. People ask me how it felt to work in a sublevel that is, structurally, the descendant of the place where I nearly died. I tell them it felt correct. I do not have a better word for it than that. Sublevel 14 of the new Harrow is not a memorial, and it is not a punishment, and it is not an act of defiance. It is a maintenance corridor with manifolds that need checking and seals that need maintaining, and I am the person who checks and maintains them, and that is the entire shape of the thing. The old sublevel taught me what a seal that fails looks like. The new one has better seals. The work is the same. The stakes, if anything, are clearer. I was on duty in sublevel 14 when the Dominion returned. The alert came at 3:47 local station time. I was doing a routine pressure check on return loop 11. There was no seal issue. I check them routinely now. I will check them until I die. When the station's tactical AI shifted the overhead lighting to the amber alert band and began its announcement sequence. 9 capital vessels dayside approach. No signal, no identification, no protocol. 18 years after the first time, It was the same 9 ships. I know this because of what came later, because someone matched the hull silhouettes against the original Dominion Strike Force registry that had been reconstructed from recovered data. Same fleet, coming back to assess what they assumed was a collapsing civilization. I set down my pressure gauge and sat on the floor of sub-level 14 for approximately 2 minutes, which I have never told anyone. I sat there and I breathed very carefully, and I thought about the seal, and I thought about the pod, and I thought about 16 years in a box while the world rebuilt itself around my absence. I thought about Marin Vostok's margin note, and about the 17 people who came home from a station that was rubble, and about the 9,000 people now living on a station that had been rebuilt from rubble, and about the 40 capital warships of the Warden fleet that were at this moment moving to intercept, and about the 112 weapons platforms along the ring that were running their power-up sequences, and about the fact that this time, unlike the last time, there was no calculation to run, no uncertainty about the outcome, no question about whether humanity would survive the visit. The only question was what the Dominion would understand when they arrived, and whether they would understand it quickly enough. Then I stood up, clipped the gauge back to my belt, and went up to the command level. The station administrator, a man named Gerv, was already at the tactical board. The Warden fleet had been alerted 40 capital warships in orbital formation, already on an intercept course. The ring platforms were running power-up sequences. The whole architecture was waking up, calm and systematic, the way Marin Vostok had insisted it wake up. No panic, no scramble, no drama. Just the machine doing what the machine was built to do. Gerv looked at me. He knew who I was. Everyone on Harrow knew who I was by then, which I found uncomfortable but had accepted as a condition of being the only person to come back from the original attack. "Cross," he said. "They're broadcasting." "What are they saying?" He turned up the audio. The Sethovar transmission was a grating modulation of consonant clusters, partly translated by the AI, still dropping words it couldn't match. The shape of it was, "Humans of Earth. We have returned to complete our assessment. Prepare for boarding." Gerv said, "We're going to respond." I said, "What do you want to say?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "I want to say everything. I want to tell them what it cost. I want them to see Marin Vostok's margin note. I want them to understand what it means that you're standing in front of me right now." He paused. "But I think they won't understand any of that until they see it." "So show them," I said. He nodded slowly. "I want to send someone to meet them, on their ship, someone who can stand there and let them look." I understood what he was saying before he said it. "You don't have to," he said. "You understand that. You have every right to say no." "I know," I said. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to think about it. Then I said, "Send me." The Sethovar command ship did not fire on the shuttle. I had been told it probably wouldn't. The Dominion's opening posture in return contacts was, based on the recovered assessment data, to demand compliance and then evaluate the response. They wanted to see what we sent. They sent a docking guidance signal, which our AI parsed into standard approach vectors, and I brought the shuttle in. I had practiced docking in the sims for 4 days. I am not a shuttle pilot. Gerv had offered me a pilot, and I had declined, because the pilot would have been the most visible person in the room, and I needed to be the most visible person in the room. You cannot send someone to be seen and then stand them behind someone else. The hangar deck of the Sethovar command ship was large. It was not as large as Harrow's main docking bay, which surprised me. I had expected their vessels to be bigger inside than ours, some residue of how I had thought about them as a child, as an impossible and overwhelming force. They were big. They were not so big that a human couldn't stand in the same room and take up a reasonable portion of it. There were 6 Sethovar in the hangar when I came down the ramp. This is the first thing I want to describe precisely, because I have been asked to describe them many times, and I think people's expectations are often wrong in the same direction. The Sethavar are not monsters. They are not designed to be frightening in the way that makes the brain shut down. They are large. The smallest in that hangar was perhaps 2.5 meters, and the largest was closer to 3. And they are scaled, deep green-black plating that catches light like wet stone, and their faces are long and their eyes are lateral, and their hands are 3-fingered with a thumb configuration that is clearly tool-adapted. They were wearing armor. The armor was functional, not ceremonial, dull matte plates with visible fastening points, and what I assumed were impact absorption panels at the joints. The rank insignia were marked in a different plating configuration, not paint or applique, but a physical difference in the armor itself, as if rank were built into the hardware. They were soldiers, not monsters, soldiers in good armor on a well-maintained ship, doing a job they had been doing for a long time. The commander stood at the center of the group. I could tell because of the rank insignia, a different configuration of plating on the right shoulder, and a marking across the chest that I later learned indicated an officer of the 4th tier of Dominion Command, and because of the way the others oriented toward him the way crew orients toward authority, without looking directly, an unconscious alignment. He was the tallest in the room. He carried no visible weapon, or rather the weapons at his hips were holstered with the holster covers engaged, which I read as a deliberate posture, armed but not reaching for them. He looked at me. I should describe what I looked like to him because this matters. I am 64 years old. I am of average height for a human man of my generation, which is to say not especially tall. I was wearing my station coveralls, which are the dark blue of Harrow's maintenance division with the anchor point badge on the left chest, because I had not thought to change and Garv had not told me to. I had not brushed my hair. I have a scar across my left forearm from the pipe joint that hit me in sub-level 14-18 years ago, and I roll my sleeves up out of habit, so the scar was visible. I am not an impressive figure, I know this. I have known it my whole life. The commander looked at me for what I estimated at 15 seconds, which is a long time to look at someone in silence. Then he spoke. His translation unit rendered it imperfectly but legibly as, "What are you?" I have thought about this moment. I have thought about what he was actually asking. I don't think he meant what species I was. They knew what species I was. I don't think he meant what my rank or function was exactly, though that was part of it. I think he was asking, in the way that a commander who has come back to assess a situation that has deviated catastrophically from his projections asks a question, something closer to, "How is this possible? How are you here? How does this exist? What are you that I am looking at instead of what I expected to be looking at?" And I had no answer. Not because the question was hard, because the answer was everything that had happened in 16 years, and I didn't have a word for that in any shared language. I stood there for what I estimated was another 10 seconds, and then I did the only thing I could think to do. I turned and pointed out the hangar viewport. The terrace ring was visible from that angle. Not all of it, you cannot see all of it from any single point. It is designed to span the full orbital shell, but 2 of the nearest weapons platforms were clear, and the curve of the ring itself was a bright structural line against the dark, and 2 Warden-class warships were holding station in visible distance, their hull lighting running in standard operational sequence. The larger warship was the Harrow's Keep, 1.4 kilometers end-to-end, and its broadside profile was presented to the viewport in the way that carries information, without requiring anyone to say what the information is. I held the point for a moment, then I turned back. The commander had not moved. He was looking at the viewport, then he looked at me again. His translation unit rendered what he said next as, "This was not here." I said, "No, it wasn't." He said, "You built this." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The 5 Sethavar behind him were also quiet. The hangar deck was very still. There was the background hum of the ship's drive systems, and the ventilation cycling, and the small sounds that any enclosed space makes when it contains living things. And underneath all of that there was a quality of silence that I recognized from the moments in maintenance work, when something you have been looking at for a long time finally becomes clear. He said, "How long?" I said, 14 years of construction, 2 years since completion. 18 years since you were last here. He processed that. I watched him process it. I watched his eyes move from me to the viewport and back, and I watched something settle in his posture, a recalculation happening in his body the way you can see it happen when a person's internal model of the world is being revised by the world itself. He said, "You should not have been capable of this." I said, "No, you assessed that we wouldn't be." A long pause. "Our assessment," I said, "was based on what you could see." He was quiet again. I said, "There are things you missed." He looked at me. The lateral eyes were strange to read, not impossible, but strange, the way a new gauge is strange before you've learned its resting state. What I read in them was not hostility, and not fear, and not the particular quality of a commander preparing to escalate. It was something more like the expression of a person who has arrived at a destination and found that the destination has moved. "What did we miss?" he said. And here is where I had an answer. "A loop seal," I said. "Sublevel 14, Harrow Station. Return loop 7. I sealed it 47 minutes into your bombardment before I went into a cryopod because if I didn't, it would cascade and vent oxygen from the hospital wing and the emergency shelter and kill everyone I hadn't already failed to protect." I paused. "The seal held for 11 days, long enough for a structural engineer named Marin Vostek to survive, long enough for 17 people to be recovered, long enough for someone to come back and find my pod under the debris and eventually dig it out and wake me up." The commander was watching me with a stillness that was, I thought, the Sethavar equivalent of very close attention. "You were in the pod," he said, "through the rebuild." "Yes." "You did not direct it." "No, I was unconscious for 16 of those 18 years. The people who built the ring built it. I didn't build it. I just made it possible for one person to survive who then did the building." I paused. I sealed a pipe joint in the dark, in a station that was being blown apart because I didn't want any more people to die than already had. That's all I did. He was quiet for a long moment. "And now you are here," he said. "And now I am here," I said. He turned and looked at the viewport again. I let him look. I was in no hurry. I had been in a pod for 16 years. I had a certain relationship with waiting. One of the Warden-class warships had shifted its angle slightly during this conversation, and it was now presenting its broadside profile to the viewport. Not aggressively, no weapons ports open, nothing pointed anywhere, just the full profile of a Warden-class hull at operational distance, which is approximately 1.4 kilometers end to end, carrying enough armament to make the calculation very simple. The second warship had not moved. It didn't need to. The ring platforms were not moving either. None of it was moving. It was all just there. The commander turned back to me. He said, 18 years ago, the Dominion's assessment determined that this civilization was non-viable for recovery without directed infusion. The assessment projected total civilizational collapse within 60 years. Yes, I said, I read the recovered report. Something in his posture shifted. We recovered our own assessment reports. We decrypted them 14 years ago, I said. The team that did it was very good. A long pause. He said, "What is your name?" "Davin Cross," I said. "Life Support Systems Technician, Harrow Station, Ring Anchor Point 4. He repeated it slowly as if testing the sounds. "Davin Cross." A pause. "You are listed in our post-strike census." "I know." "You are listed as confirmed dead." "I know." "You survived because you sealed a pipe." "Essentially, yes." He was quiet again. He was doing something, I realized, that I recognized from long maintenance shifts where you discover that the problem is not where you thought it was. He was revising. Not just the tactical situation, not just the ring and the warden fleet and the weapons platforms, but the whole picture. The calculation of what humanity was and what it meant, and whether the original assessment had been wrong in a small way or a very large way. I waited. He said, "The Dominion will need to file a revised assessment." "Yes," I said. "I expect so." The revised assessment will require the fleet to withdraw for consultation. I said nothing. This did not require my response. He said, "I will need documentation of the station and the ring's construction timeline, official records." "We anticipated that," I said. "Harrow Station's complete construction record, the terrace ring design archive, and the formal census records showing station population and defense architecture personnel are in a data package already transmitted to your ship. Your signals officer should have received it approximately 90 minutes ago." He looked at one of his crew members, who made a gesture I took to indicate confirmation. He turned back to me. He looked at me for a long time. "You came alone," he said. "Yes." "A maintenance technician?" "Yes." "To represent your civilization." I thought about that. "I'm the right person," I said. "I'm the only person still alive who was here for both. I was here when you came the first time and I'm here now. I can tell you what the difference is because I saw the before and I see the after." I paused. There aren't many people who can say that. He processed that. "What is the difference?" he said. It was not a hostile question. It was a genuine one. A commander of the fourth tier of Dominion authority, standing on the hangar deck of a capital ship in front of a life support technician in maintenance coveralls, asking what the difference was between the humanity he had assessed 18 years ago and the one he was looking at now. I thought about how to answer it. 18 years ago, I said, we had stations and ships and platforms and cities and we thought they were enough. We thought we were secure because we had built things. I paused. We weren't ready. We had built the things, but we hadn't decided collectively that we were going to remember and prepare and not let it happen again. We had hope, and hope is not a defense architecture. I let that sit for a moment. After you left, I said, we decided. We didn't debate it or vote on it or put it to consultation. It was just known. It became the thing that everyone was doing all at once without anyone having to say it out loud. Marin Vostek said build it larger than you need because they will come back and we are not doing this twice. And everyone around her said yes, and they built it, and then the next group built more, and then the next group after that. I paused. The difference is that we stopped hoping it wouldn't happen again and started making sure it couldn't. The hangar was very quiet. And the loop seal, he said. It surprised me that he came back to that. And the loop seal, I said. One person in a damaged station sealing a pipe so that another person might survive. He paused. That was not in our assessment either. No, I said, I don't imagine it was. He was quiet for a moment. He said Davin Cross, confirmed dead Sethavar Dominion post-strike census, record 7714 Harrow. He paused. You are clearly not. No, I said, I'm not. He looked at me once more. The lateral eyes moved across my face with the careful attention of a commander who is revising a very large calculation, and I thought, there it is. There's the moment. Not the ring, not the warships, not the weapons platforms. The moment is this. A man who was in their records as dead, standing in front of them alive, in a civilization that was in their records as non-viable, standing inside something that should not exist. He said nothing more for a moment. Then he said, the fleet will withdraw. I said, I know. The Dominion will file its revised assessment within 30 Dominion cycles. He paused. We will not return before the assessment is complete and the High Council has reviewed its implications. Understood, I said. He turned partially, a movement toward his crew that I understood as the precursor to ending the meeting. Then he paused. He looked at me one more time. He said, "The pipe seal in the damaged station. How long did it take you?" 47 minutes, I said. In darkness? Mostly, yes. The orange emergency lighting was on, but 2 of the 4 fixtures had failed. While the station was under bombardment. Yes. He was quiet. I said it needed to be done. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he made a gesture I didn't have a frame for, not a human gesture, not anything I had read about, something specific to the Sethavar, a movement of the right hand that I could not interpret but which the crew behind him all mirrored briefly, before settling back to their prior stances. I learned later, from the Dominion's own documentation on diplomatic protocol that our signals team eventually extracted from the data archives the Dominion transmitted in their formal retreat confirmation, that it is a gesture with no direct translation. The closest approximation that the translation AI would offer was something like, recognized as standing. He said, the Dominion will complete its withdrawal within 6 hours. Harrow Station will be informed via standard transmission when the fleet has cleared your system boundary. I said thank you. And then I walked back up the ramp to the shuttle and flew myself back to Harrow. Garv was waiting in the docking bay. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they expected to go wrong and didn't. I climbed down and he said, "Well." I said, "They're leaving." I let out a long breath. "What did you say to them?" he said. "Mostly the truth," I said, "and I showed them the ring and let the ring do the rest." He waited because he is a patient man. "I told them about the loop seal," I said, "and about Marin Vostek, and about being in the pod." I paused. He asked what the difference was between 18 years ago and now. "What did you say?" I thought about it. I said we stopped hoping it wouldn't happen again and started making sure it couldn't. Garv was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Was that enough?" I looked through the docking bay's observation port at the ring. The nearest weapons platform was visible in the middle distance, running its normal operational lighting, steady and still against the dark. The ring was enough, I said. I was just the reason he believed it. The Dominion fleet cleared the system boundary at 1712 local station time. Their departure transmission was brief and formal, in the flat modulated consonants of Sethavar official communication, and our translation AI rendered it in the standard way, confirming withdrawal, citing pending reassessment, acknowledging the ring architecture as a recognized factor of strategic recalculation. Standard language. The kind of language you use when the record needs to reflect what happened without anyone having to say what it actually felt like. I was back in sub-level 14 by the time it arrived. I had a pressure check to finish on loop 11 that I had left half done, and a maintenance discipline that I had spent 41 years building was not going to be interrupted because I had spent a morning on a Sethavar warship. The gauge showed nominal. The seal was good. The whole loop was good. I sat down on the floor with my back against the manifold housing in the orange-tinged light of the deep infrastructure, and I thought about Marin Vostek's margin note, Loop 7 held, build from that. She died 4 years ago, at 73, 3 years after the ring was declared complete. I attended the service on Harrow's observation deck, with 9,000 other people, and a number of others who came in from elsewhere along the ring because she had worked with them or trained them or simply been in their lives in the way that people who build things for 14 years without stopping are in the lives of everyone around them. I didn't speak at the service. I didn't know her well enough to speak, and I didn't want to misrepresent what I had to her. But I stood there and I thought, everything I woke up to, she built. Everything that was there when I opened my eyes was there because she was one of 17 people that the loop seal saved. She never said it that way. She would have been irritated by the framing, I think. She built the ring because it needed building, and because she was the best person available to build it, and because she understood very clearly that if it wasn't built, the Dominion would return to a soft target. Not because a maintenance technician sealed a loop in the dark. She would have said, the seal didn't build the ring. 14 years of engineering and labor and getting things right built the ring. She was correct. She was also wrong. It doesn't have to be one or the other. The seal didn't build the ring. The seal made it possible for the person to survive who did. Those are two different claims, and both of them are true, and neither cancels the other. This is something I have thought about more than I probably should have, sitting in sublevels and running pressure checks, but maintenance work gives you a great deal of time for thinking. And the question of what causes what in a long chain of events has always interested me more than it probably should interest a man whose professional life is primarily pipes and seals and manifold couplings. The simple answer is, nothing that happened after the bombardment happened because of one thing. It happened because of many things accumulated: the seal, Vostok, the 17 people, the decision to rebuild, the decision to build larger than necessary, the Warden fleet, the 47 years of engineering and labor and argument and revision that went into every kilometer of the ring. And somewhere behind all of it, further back than most people trace it, a bureaucratic decision made 60 years before my birth to put emergency cryopods in a sublevel that no one except maintenance technicians ever visited. Whoever made that decision did not know they were making a decision that would matter. They were just following a safety standard. They were just doing the job correctly. And 18 years after the bombardment, a HFY commander of the 4th tier stood on his own hangar deck and tried to categorize an old man in maintenance coveralls who should not have existed, and found that he could not, and the closest word his translation unit could offer was something like standing, which is not a rank or a title but a condition. The condition of being recognized as still here. That is what I would tell the HFY commander now if I had a second chance at the question. That is what I am, or the nearest I can come to answering it. Someone who did the job correctly in the dark, under bombardment, with a bleeding arm, because the job was there and I was the one in front of it. Not for glory, not for history, not for any reason that would be legible in a Dominion assessment, or a diplomatic record, or a margin note in a set of engineering plans. Because the seal needed making. The HFY Dominion's revised assessment came through official channels 9 months after the fleet's withdrawal. I am not a diplomat, and I did not participate in its receipt or the formal response. I read a summary that Garv sent to my station inbox, because he sends me summaries of things he thinks I should know, which I have accepted as a condition of being Harrow's particular kind of historical artifact. The summary noted that the Dominion's revised assessment had reclassified humanity's civilization status from non-viable, pending collapse, to established independent power, ring 4 of 6 on the Dominion's formal recognition scale. Ring 4 is, according to the attached notation, the classification the Dominion assigns to civilizations it has assessed as capable of mutual deterrence and worthy of formal diplomatic engagement. Rings 1 through 3 are non-recognition classifications. Rings 5 and 6 are reserved for civilizations the Dominion considers its equals or superiors. The reclassification took 9 months, which I understand is fast for Dominion administrative procedure. Someone, apparently, made the case that the revision did not require the full formal cycle. Garv's note at the bottom of the summary said, "I thought you'd want to see this." The commander's deposition cites the loop seal specifically. I read that 3 times. I don't know what it is, exactly, to have a loop seal cited in a HFY Dominion formal revision of civilizational status. I don't think there's a precedent for it. I don't think there is a protocol specialist in any government on Earth who could tell me with confidence what category of diplomatic act it represents. I know what it feels like. It feels like standing in sublevel 14 at 4:15 in the morning with a pressure gauge in your hand and a stable reading on the manifold, knowing that the seal is good, knowing that the loop is holding, knowing that the job that needed to be done was done, and none of the credit or the history or the weight of it changes the simple fact that the seal is good and the people behind the seal are breathing. The alien commander asked me what I was, and I had no answer. But I think if I had to give one now, in this station, in this sub-level, in the quiet after everything, it would be this. The kind of person who, when the lights go out and the station is falling, and there is a seal that needs making, makes it. That's all, that's the whole answer. And it was, in the end, enough.